Pontypool and hello mutts. I'm Devin Shepherd
And I'm David B. Jacobs.
and we are the Cadaver Dogs and we are joined today with our very special guest, Instagram friend for like forever, also friend of the pod, Ellie. Ellie, who is also known as Bad Critic, which I'm sure you've seen all over Instagram and the internet. Ellie writes about movies for herself, but also for horror press, trying to avoid looking at films through a typical auteur lens and instead writing about the labor that goes into making a film. Highly respect that. Thank you so much. You can find Ellie on Instagram at Bad Critic or by following the links in our show notes because she is an amazing writer and we want to support everything that she reviews. Ellie, welcome to the show.
Oh, that's so nice. Thank you so much for having me. We have been internet friends for a very long time, so I'm excited to talk about what we have on the docket today. Although, est-ce que peut-être on devrait switcher en français? Est-ce que la langue anglaise va nous infecter avec leurs mots? I don't know, guys. Will you tell us?
I don't know. I don't know.
We are not supposed to translate this message. However, what I did say is, should we switch to French because the English language might infect us?
I took French for like 3 or 4 years in high school. Therefore, I don't speak a word of it.
I understand. Like most Canadians, yeah.
I can understand it. I loved going to Montreal rather than Paris because I'm like, speak French to me and I will understand you. I will not
Yeah.
be able to reply, but your accent is so much better than the Parisian accent. Thank
Oh my
you.
god, thank you so much for saying that.
I'm okay when it's written. Like I can kind of make sense
Yeah.
sometimes. Maybe I would have been able to do that better in high school, but it takes me some time. Listening comprehension was never. It's nope.
Yeah. No,
Something
that's
different.
Gone.
that's fair. When you're in it, it's much easier, but if you don't have it around you all the time,
Yeah.
it's much more difficult.
I think I learned visually better than auditorially.
Yeah.
Yeah, which yeah. I
As a
no, I was like, "Oh, well,
podcaster, makes
that
a
goes
lot
a
of
little bit into our
sense.
first film." Yeah. But Ellie, I wanted to introduce you to our listeners and kind of what we'd like to ask our guests at the top is just like your how you entered the horror realm or in your case like the film review realm because you've been writing about films for how long now?
Well, I started over the pandemic because, my family and friends were tired of listening to me rant about movies, and so I figured I might as well do it to the internet.
Safe space.
I studied film in university and college, so I've always been a big film nerd, and I love horror movies. So I particularly focus on writing about horror and independent film because I think horror often embodies the best of filmmaking and also sometimes the worst, let's be real. But like I think it's just a fascinating way to tell stories. I'm a horror girly. What can I say? That's just how it is, you know. Yeah.
I love that. That's what I usually tell people when I'm like when they ask why I like horror and I'm like, "Well, it is kind of the space in film where you can do the most and say the most." So, it's
Yeah.
the place that you can be the
That's
most
true.
artsy.
You can go real crazy with it. As we saw
Yeah.
this year with The Substance, you know? Just go fucking
Yeah.
nuts. Yeah.
It's been so great to watch people's reactions to The Substance. They're like, "Wait, this is kind of insane." I'm like, "Oh, clearly you haven't seen like any 80s horror film."
I saw that movie at a test screening. I had three friends. One of them is Devin and I's friend Alec, who's like a very big horror guy as well. And the other two are not really horror people. And I think like almost just as much fun as the movie was just watching these two grown ass men just like break down and like have their lives just be ruined by this movie.
Oh my god, that's so much fun.
They did not like it. I was
Uh,
very happy about that. I think that made it better.
there's something particularly joyous about like watching someone who doesn't normally watch horror, like sort of like react. It's just like
Hmm.
so fresh and new, and you're like, I remember being that way once, you know? Like I remember being
Yeah.
shocked by things.
I remember having feelings when I watch horror movies.
They're
Yes.
like, yeah, it was like sexy until it wasn't sexy, but I guess that's the point.
And to hear more about this filmmaker, go check out our Revenge episode where we discussed Coralie Faget's premiere film. Wow, I
Yep,
went to French in that. Yeah, premiere
That's
that's
what we're
film.
okay.
doing now.
He's
That's what we're
also
doing.
French.
On va tout être en français au fin de l'épisode. That's where we're going now.
Well, I think that's a good, as we start speaking French, that's a good segue into our first film, which I'm excited to hear more about Ellie's background because I think it fits so perfectly with the two films that we have coming for you today because they are independent, they are Canadian, they are French, kind of, sort of, they are artsy. I think it's hidden on the boxes.
That's right. Here we go.
But first, a quick announcement.
Oh, we have an announcement.
For those of you who've been listening to us for some time, you may remember our third co host, Rob Pasersha, who left last year in order to spend more time with his family. Well, as of this past week that we're recording, October 8th, he now has a new baby girl named Nicole Pasersha. She is very beautiful. She is a little cadaver pup.
Rob is going to make her watch so many horror movies at a young age. Don't worry, guys. It's going to be great.
It'll be great. She
Oh,
she is our future.
that's so sweet. Congratulations.
Oh, thank you for doing that, David. We're very excited to be docky aunties and uncles.
And also, I apologize for my sound quality. My microphone is not working for some reason. So,
Guys, share our podcast so we can start affording better microphones. That's all I'm gonna say.
and better
Yes.
computers.
Better computers.
Do you guys have a Patreon or a
No, we do this for free. We're just giving it to the world.
okay.
And you can Venmo us.
Yeah.
Listeners, Venmo David some money for new equipment. Okay? If you love this episode, they work so hard on it. Go send them a couple bucks just to compensate. You spend money on what? Big blockbuster movies. Go spend it on the podcast that you love.
Yeah, that's true. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate that. All right, Devin, get us started.
Grant Massey, a former big city radio host, starts work at a radio station in the small town of Pontypool, Ontario. Sorry, I was practicing my radio voice. For the early hours of the morning show, Massey is joined by producer Sydney Breyer and assistant Laurel Ann Drummond. It's clear that Massey and Sydney clash on the point of the radio show, or at least the ideology of what a morning show can accomplish. And this clash comes to a head when they start receiving bizarre and violent call ins. Listeners are sounding like they're speaking gibberish. Something's going on outside. Riots, a hostage situation, and a mob starts surrounding the office of Dr. Mendez. The station's helicopter reporter Ken describes the scene from his sunshine shopper in the sky, or rather his truck parked on a hill. As the situation escalates, the team learns that a virus is spreading, causing infected individuals to repeat words and phrases before killing their loved ones or anyone close to them. That's when poor Laurel Ann begins to show symptoms. Luckily, Dr. Menendez suddenly bursts through the window and arrives at the station and explains to the team that the virus is transmitted through the English language, infecting certain words and spreading when the words are then understood. The group then barricades themselves inside the recording booth to protect themselves from Laura Ann from hearing them, and thus infecting themselves. A mob of what we'll call language zombies starts to grow outside. To avoid infection, the group tries to speak in French, but soon Sydney becomes infected. Mazzy manages to, quote, cure her by changing the context of the cursed word so that they are unable to understand the words that are said. Energized by this discovery, Mazzy and Sydney begin to broadcast, hoping that they can change the meaning of the infected words and thus save the world. But military forces soon arrive, hoping to stop the broadcast, claiming that Mazzy is infected. Mazzy and Sydney continue to broadcast, causing the military to bomb the station. And the film goes dark. This is Pontypool, directed by Bruce McDonald and written by Tony Burgess. Man, don't do speech to text when you're writing a fucking summary. I'm like, what are these fucking words that my phone thinks it's saying?
Oh boy.
And yet apt for this movie, I would say.
I know.
The director actually calls the zombies conversationalists, which
I like that better.
I also really like that. I'm like, oh, that's neat. And one of the things that I didn't even think about until you pointed it out, Devin, while we were outlining, but like when the army is invading at the end of the movie, if you actually translate what they're saying, then they're saying like, don't listen to Mazzy. He's sick. He's infected. We need to stop this broadcast because he's going to get more people sick. And that's obviously not what's being shown to us, but is it true? Is Grant sick? Is he a reliable narrator? What
Mhm.
do y'all think?
Yeah, I didn't think of him really as an unreliable narrator. I think the crescendo for this movie I think is really just so chaotic, and just the concept of like changing what words mean as a cure. it invites this chaos. Like, is it really a cure at that point, or is it just staving off something worse? And of course, the military would not be interested in something as poetic as that as a cure, you know.
Of
So
course
they're just
not.
gonna bomb the shit out of everything, you know.
Yeah, you're right, because like, the timeline of when you're infected to when you become this conversationalist zombie, it is kind of weird in this film, because we see Sydney obviously get some symptoms and then is sustained. The doctor, Dr. Mendez, also showing symptoms, but then seems to be doing okay, question mark. I guess that's to us to decide. And then obviously Laurel Ann is kind of like more quick to fall apart from the first symptom that we see her exhibit. So it does make me question, yeah, like, could Grant be sick the entire time? And I mean, we open this movie with a broadcast of Grant's in which he is talking about the missing cat called Honey. And we
Mhm.
soon learn that some of the curse words are endearing words, including honey. And he's
Oh,
saying this
is
broadcast, and he's saying honey over and over and over and over again. And I don't know about you guys, but I went back and I listened to this broadcast a couple times, and I'm, like, trying to make sense of it. It does not make sense. Like, it
No.
it it just, like, kinda devolves into gibberish, and that's something that we see the zombies do. They just, like, stop making sense. So then it, like, does make me question, is Grant sick, or is he just a radio show host?
Or is
is
he like a vector, right? Is he sort of a little immune on his part because he's always pontificating, he's always ruminating, and
Ah.
does he have a kind of immunity? But his broadcast infecting people?
is he immune because he is so incredibly pretentious that saying random words and stringing them together in a way that seems to make sense but does not is just what he does normally, regardless?
Is the alcohol a buffer? You know what I mean?
I had that question. Is the alcohol a buffer?
Ooh,
Yeah.
interesting.
I mean, I don't
Huh.
know if you want to get into this right now, but like this is based on a book that's a book of prose, essentially. Bruce McDonald's interpretation of Tim's book of prose that is not really doesn't really have a narrative at all.
Oh.
So it's kind of like he took the vibe of the story and vibe of that book and created a narrative around it. And so I think a lot of the unanswered questions are you can sort of chalk up to just like vibing with the poetry of the situation.
There's also a sequel that brings back same director, same writer, same two lead actors, Stephen McHattie and Lisa Hoole, who in that one is named Lisa. That's interesting. But the sequel also, I haven't seen it, but it's basically the post credits from this movie extended as a feature film, is my understanding, and
Mhm.
it is very unclear how these are connected, except that we are told that they are. And
Hmm.
that's also kind of ties into that opening monologue where he's talking about forging connections between things that aren't connected. So
Mhm.
the main interpretations that I came across of that post credits is either one, it doesn't make sense because it is curing us, the audience, of the disease, in the way
Mm.
that you cure by not understanding, you cure by creating connections that aren't there. So that's why the post credits is there, to cure us. And the other explanation that I heard is that it doesn't make sense because it's making fun of us, because it's making fun of our urge to draw these connections, which it's almost funny how those two interpretations kind of line up with the two ideas of either Grant is totally onto something, everything he is doing is the right thing, he understands this disease and is combating it properly. Understanding the disease, that's kind of a paradox, isn't it, if the understanding leads you to not understand. And the other interpretation, the one where it's just gibberish as mockery, leads you to the idea that, okay, so Grant isn't onto something, he is sick. His whole idea of how to cure his disease, why do we assume it works? Does it work? Are we sure it works? And the more I think about it, the more I do kind of lean toward the idea that I'm not convinced that everything we know about this disease should be taken at face value.
That's
The
fair.
the entire idea of what it is comes from the doctor, Dr. Mendez, who like climbs in through their window and then just gives them like, "Oh, it's the words themselves are cursed, I decided." And why do we believe him? Like, they're all just like, "That's ridiculous," and then they roll with it.
I feel like there are signs of it though. I mean, they do receive a transmission that they aren't supposed to translate and do that also says, that these words are cursed and that the English language is cursed.
Mhm.
But it also contradicts them because in that message it says that terms of endearment are cursed, and then in the end, the word that Sydney is getting stuck on is kill. The kill is not a term of
Mm.
endearment. I mean, maybe in some communities, but I don't think that's what we're going for. And they cure allegedly her by churning the word kill into kiss, which is a term of endearment. So that also is fighting against itself.
On this latest rewatch that I did, I've seen this movie a few times now, and I the that post credit scene, I'm always just like, the fuck, what were you guys on? What did you guys take? Come on now. I know you took something.
I
I
don't know
know.
if it's true or not, but I saw someone say that was supposed to be before the credits, and test audiences were confused.
Oh, yeah, of course they were. I mean, Dreamland, this quote unquote sequel has been described by everybody as like incomprehensible. So, and I've never watched it, but look, they're on a trip and they're loving life, so that's fine with me. But to go back to what you were saying, David, about the words, I felt like it's not necessarily a term of endearment or a term of violence, but a kind of word that might drill in deep into someone's psyche. At one point, at one point, Sydney looks at Laurel Ann and says, understand, uh, or listen. She says something like very emphatically. And you can see something start tweaking in Laurel Ann's mind. And so I wonder if it's a more personal type, unique to each person, of like a certain word that might trigger something that has more
Hmm.
meaning than just a casual the, you, me kind of word, you know?
Yeah, yeah, totally.
Yeah, and so that's why I kind of feel like it might, like, words terms of endearment are quite personal, they're quite unique, and so that might be more common a common thing to infect people, but a word like kill is quite unique also, you know?
It's a strong word, and I mean, looking at that moment of when Sydney becomes infected, she ain't doing okay. She's really struggling with a lot of
Mhm.
stuff,
Mhm.
and she's getting drunk, feeling the guilt of having been a part of murder, essentially, of another infected person. And it is true, like when you were describing the thing with Laurel Ann, it's true when Sydney decides that she like wants Mazzy to kill her, that's when her mind she's like fully understand, fully prepared to die or to be killed, and that's when her mind starts to go a little bit.
Yeah, and it's like a vulnerability, yeah.
And
Yeah.
then when they change kill to kiss, her first reaction is now that she wants Mr. Massey to kiss her.
Mhm.
Which, like, has not been built up and is, like, the most, like, "What the hell is happening?"
And
moment
I
of the
feel like
entire
that's the
movie.
point. I don't think there is supposed to be any romantic tension at any point in the movie. I think the romance angle gets sprung out of nowhere on purpose because kill is kiss.
I think it's a little 2008, to be honest. I'm just like assuming that there's like a little bit of tension just because like there's a woman there. You know what I mean? That's my reading of it.
I'm very on this
Yeah.
idea now that I don't think Mr. Mazzy's cure works. I
I love that interpretation though.
Also worth noting, Dr. John Mendez, who later comes up with the prescription for this idea, he is currently under investigation for writing too many phony prescriptions.
Right.
Yes. So is he a quack, or is he just, or is he? There's a very, again, very 2008 undercurrent of like racism in this movie.
Great.
Oh,
His
Do it.
cool.
character doesn't have a whitish name that you would normally find in a town like a small Ontario town. So
Yeah,
I wonder if, he's under investigation. Is that a bit of a witch hunt situation, or is he just
interesting.
a crook? Is he a crank?
It's a good question. I like and I let's look at that because like, then that means he's kind of like an outsider in the town, right? And who else is an outsider in the town? It's
Mhm.
Mazzy.
Mhm. Mhm.
Um, and it's kind of like these small towns, they are very insular. And so when
Absolutely.
people come, it changes things up. I mean, Mazzy's trying to things change things up and Sydney's like, you can't do that. Like people like how it is. People you can't like do anything different. You can't bring these big ideas or like anything from the outside world. Like we all live in basically knowing our neighbors and doing the same thing every day. It's kind of
Yeah.
like the intention. So yeah, I could see it being like people attacking outsiders who are quote unquote infecting their way of life.
Yeah. Or is it that like people start to feel sick and they just headed to the doctor? That's the doctor in this town. You have a small town, there's one doctor, you know.
Hmm.
So people who were starting to feel something that was wrong to them, you're going to your local doctor. And that's why that building was so overwhelmed immediately.
That makes sense.
That
Yeah.
makes sense. Writing fake prescriptions could also just be the opioid crisis.
We did mention that Laurel Ann is a veteran. She's a hometown hero. This is 2008. Um, the Iraq War is going on. A lot is happening. And of course, we see Lawrence of the Arabians. They mention Osama bin Laden. They mention a bunch of like war on terror stuff. So I wanted to ask the question, what is the significance of having one of the main characters be a war veteran at this point in time?
She served in Afghanistan, and famously, Canada did not join the U.S.'s crazy efforts in Iraq. But we did send troops to Afghanistan, which So on the one hand, in Canada, there's always a lot of pride with the troops, but there was a lot of animosity as well because of seeing where the U.S. went with Iraq, which a lot of people in Canada disagreed with the government's decision not to do that, or the prime minister's big fuck you to George Bush, essentially.
You mean that some people in Canada felt that you should have cut joined in Iraq?
Oh well, if you want to tangent a little bit, so again, I grew up in Quebec, and it was very welcomed when he was like, "Absolutely no, we are not joining Iraq," because
Hmm.
Quebec does not like to do things with the federal government. So I always thought it was a very applauded decision until in recent years I went back to sort of read about what the media reaction was to it, and I was shocked to find so many articles eviscerating
Hmm.
the decision. And it was only when I checked in with a friend who'd grown up in Ontario and who had said like, "Oh no, I remember getting in fights with the adults in my life who were like, it's an abomination that we're not that we're letting down our biggest allies and blah 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 this and that." So it was definitely Canada does love the U.S. quite a bit. So yeah, so back to Laurel Ann. I think it's a sign of the times, right? Like there was quite a few people who were in the military and who had been in Afghanistan who were back in regular society. But I think it's also perhaps speaks to why she is the first to really be infected in their
Hmm.
isolated area, right? Maybe there's something about being a soldier and the cognitive dissonance that's required to be a soldier that makes her more vulnerable to this kind of infection.
Yeah.
Yeah, totally. What I wrote down is that I found it interesting because the big conflict between Grant and Sydney throughout the early parts of the movie is that Grant really wants to push all these buttons, he wants to piss people off, he wants to get into the bigger stories, he wants to sort of make fun of the smaller ones. And Sydney is very much like, no, 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 we're a small town, we don't need to do any big news, just like put on the fluff pieces, put on the Lawrence and the Arabians that we like, we're making everything very digestible, very easy, very nice. And meanwhile, Laurel Ann is the one who's actually lived the news. She has actually
Mm.
experienced these things firsthand. That while Grant and Sydney, I keep forgetting Sydney's name because she just does not feel like a Sydney.
Sydney Breyer, yeah.
Grant and Sydney keep arguing over how to present the news. They're almost like just losing the actual news itself. And then Laurel
Yeah.
Ann is again the first to fall. She's the first one to become the news.
And Laurel Ann is supporting Mazzie's argument, at this point. You can tell she looks up to him.
Yes.
She's feeding him these stories. She's kinda going against some of the stuff that Sydney says not to do, which is like, "No, don't send that to Grant's computer. Do not give him that to air." Which, like, yeah, I guess would say a lot if she wants the town to understand what's happening, the darker side of the world, essentially.
Hmm.
Yeah, and I feel like I'm trying to remember 2008, but I think there was a lot of conversation around, like, what should we be showing on the television from this war? I didn't listen to the radio. Yeah, and what should we how detailed should we go? I mean, famously, we have talked about it so many times on this podcast, but the Vietnam War, I feel like that was always a big topic of
Yep.
conversation as well, and we saw a repeat of that when we sent a bajillion people to Afghanistan.
Famously, they did not show a lot of the images from the Iraq War.
Yeah, until, like, 2008, which is when Obama came to office and when we killed Osama in
2000
2010.
2010?
2010. It was, yeah, because it was, I remember I went to the site to see everyone celebrate. Yeah, that it was very interesting. A lot of people celebrating a death was fascinating.
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
that was weird.
And I remember feeling very weird that no one was talking about how weird it was that, like,
Yes.
that's what being a leftist on the internet is like.
I liked what you were saying in terms of that people weren't seeing images, so they didn't, let's say, understand this war,
Mhm.
right?
Mm.
They
Mhm.
didn't comprehend, much like that you need to in order to get this disease. Do we feel like this is kind of deceptive? I feel like this is what's presented in the beginning of this movie, and is that like the news, does it have a duty in order to not necessarily just tell the truth, but does it have a duty to like go to the extreme of telling all the truths? Or are
Mm.
we allowed to have a little bit of deception in order to make the news, as David put it, more manageable for this small town? Because Mazzy is out there and he's like, I just want to tell everything.
Yeah,
I'm full disclosure. What does he say? No prisoners. I'm
no
no prisoners, no
prisoners, no
slaves.
filter, yeah.
Mazzy's idea of full disclosure, I think, is a bit pushing buttons for the sake of pushing buttons. Sydney like casually mentions like, "Oh, bring it down a bit. These people are probably just drunk," and then Mazzy just literally just says that on air, like, "Oh, all those cops are drunk," is what I'm hearing, and it's
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, dude, you don't. First off, you don't know that. Like, that's not news. That's just you're kind of just making a mockery of the situation at this point. And then, of course, like 60 seconds later, Sydney pulls him aside and goes, like, "Hey, that's like my brother-in-law."
Yeah, like, chill, bro. Just be cool.
But he is making assumptions.
Yeah.
And like, yeah, those assumptions could be true. Also, like, bro, you're drinking alcohol like this entire broadcast. You drunk as fuck. Don't
Yeah,
even.
it doesn't feel like journalism what he's doing. It
Mm.
feels like there's no search for the truth. He is just sort of saying what comes into his head. He's just babbling essentially.
Mhm.
He's spitting out whatever comes through and trying to make sense of it, but also kind of not connecting dots or connecting dots where there necessarily aren't.
And I mean, that's probably the reason why he's in Pontypool to begin with, you
Indeed.
know?
That's true.
I think every time I watch this movie, I'm really struck by just the lyricism. There's a rhythm to the dialogue. It's very beautifully written, except for
Hmm.
the every time I watch it, the brown face is fucking shocking to me. It's very
Yeah.
2008 of like we're commenting on racism by doing racism. But what I thought a lot about with this movie is how do you break through propaganda, right? The line between informing people what they need to know versus overwhelming people with too much information. Sometimes the more you explain to people, the less they believe you. I would say, case in point, with COVID science, as much as maybe the World Health Organization tried to explain how what they previously thought about the disease had changed or they had new information and so they had new recommendations, that only added to the distrust and to the paranoia. So I think oftentimes information can be destructive. That said, how do you break through propaganda? How do you break someone out of propaganda? Well, you have to redefine what the words mean, right? At the end, the sort of when she's saying kill, 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 and he says kill is kiss, sometimes explaining to people the facts about why a certain propagandist lie is a lie and destructive, the facts won't help them, right? Explaining to someone why vaccines are safe won't convince them that they're safe. You kind of have to have a different way of getting to them that taps into something much deeper, right? Breaking someone out of a QAnon cycle, you can explain to them why it's nonsense what they're believing, but that won't break them out of that cycle. But the smallest little emotional truths might.
Yeah, there's so much going on in this movie that I feel like my head's spinning trying to understand it, as we were saying, and
Yeah,
is
definitely.
just like so much beautiful
Hmm.
prose and poeticness about it. But I feel like your explanation just then was like, oh, my brain has calmed and I feel like I have a pathway of like understanding now
Sick.
what they're trying to do.
I just think it's also a solid horror movie. Like there's some really great gory moments. So the moment where the she takes the kettle, Sydney takes the kettle off of off of the burner and Laurel Ann is still mimicking that sound is one of the creepiest things I've
Agreed.
seen. It's such a good moment. I love there's a moment where they refer to a herd of people, and I feel like it's such a weird thing to say, a herd of people, you know?
Yeah, it does so well at, like, allowing you to visualize what's going on outside of this booth because it's a single
Mhm.
location film for the most part. Yeah, I feel like all of this setup I agree, the herds of people really got me because up to this point, we're hearing, like, it's a grandmother, it's a child, it's a
Mhm.
teenage boy learning to drive a truck for the fir like, it's like all these images, and when they say herd people, I'm like, I'm literally seeing, like, a working class town.
Yeah,
Yeah.
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 And I think the other thing that always like we didn't really talk too much about the language stuff that comes into play, but like towards the end of the movie, they're like, "Oh, the French Canadian military has like established checkpoints." I was like, I don't know why it never occurred to me before, but like, there's no such thing as a French Canadian military. It's just it's just a
Curious
Canadian
about that.
military. A lot of people speak French in the Canadian military.
Well,
Like,
talking about
are
like the war
you
on
talking?
terror and all that, I mean,
Yeah,
it all comes
yeah,
back into that because when we're discussing it in US or in Canada, we're talking about something that's happening all the way on the other side of the world, which is why we're even like really able to have the privilege of this
absolutely, yeah,
debate about how we present it to people. Like, oh, do we
Mm,
soften the blow a bit? Do we like attack them with the truths? Most of us haven't actually been there. We haven't been on that
yeah.
front line. But over the course of this movie, they will become the front line. They are the
Mm.
ground zero. Uh,
Mhm.
they're the ones who are now like BBC is calling up to interview Grant Mazzy as
Oh
the
yeah.
ground zero patient. And he's like, what the fuck? That's the station I want to be working at.
That was also probably one of the realest moments of like something controversial with French is happening. Is it a separatist thing? Like immediately international media is like, oh, the evil French people are trying to take away your language.
Can you define the separatist thing real fast?
Listen, the history of Canada is just as colonialized as anywhere else, and there is a fight between the British colonizers and the French colonizers, and the British colonizers won. And so, as Canada was colonizing, or as the British were colonizing many Indigenous lands, they also heavily relied on the Catholic Church to control the French settlers who remained in the territory. And that created a history of inequality, basically treating French speakers as laborers. However, and so in the 60s, there's a movement called the Quiet Revolution, where Quebec really built up a lot more institutions to take control of their own culture, of their own language. And in modern day, that translates to a lot of trying to control the resources outside of international corporations that destroy the environment, the communities, but also a very nationalistic right wing movement that is very exclusionary of who is allowed to be French and thus live here. I think I did okay with that.
Yeah, no.
Thank you.
Separatist is usually a word that English speakers will use to describe anyone who shows any kind of dissent from a federalist mentality. Most people in Quebec would refer to it as a sovereigntist movement or souveraineté. I've worked in situations before where like some kind of like kerfuffle happens over like someone's language usage, and then you'll get like calls from the news desk outside of like the National Post or whatever and be like, can we talk about how mean the French people are? And you're like, fuck off. Like, we're all French here. Get fucked.
Well,
So it's a very contentious, everyone kind of has their own opinion and everyone kind of sucks.
that makes sense.
It's interesting to add that to the view of this movie though, because it's like, yeah, because of the moment where the BBC is like, it's the separatists, are they attacking everybody?
Yeah.
But then also like because it's only the English language that is infected, some viewers have seen this film as
Hmm.
separatist propaganda.
That's very
Oh,
funny to me.
interesting. Oh, that
That's
makes sense though.
very
Yeah,
funny
yeah,
to
because
me.
you actually need to go to speak French, so it's in favor of the French colonialists over the English colonialists.
Right, but maybe it is more of a comment as Ellie was saying about like, this movie does touch a lot and talks a lot about racism and like are we also talking about colonization then here?
It also, by the way, makes no sense that English is the only cursed language because the idea is that you become infected when you understand the word. So if English
Mm.
is not a language that you speak and you speak French first, then you would understand the French words just as well. So why can't that be infected? It doesn't really make sense.
I could argue that like English is a much more universal language, and therefore maybe the disease or the infection spreads quicker. Maybe it takes more time within a different
Mm.
language. I also just think it's very funny that like I was thinking about this watching it. I was like, you know, so let's I'm not gonna say French Canadian military because that's just very funny. But say it was like the Quebec provincial police, the Sûreté du Québec. Say the Sûreté du Québec was like, we're gonna set up checkpoints, which they probably would, but then we're gonna go in and help people. Absolutely not. They would not do. Depending on who's in charge of the government. Maybe in 2008 the government would have, the current government would have been like, get fucked, guys. Va chier, on s'en fout de vous, genre.
So
I just swore a lot of French, guys. Sorry.
here
Yeah.
I think my final point, unless you guys have more to add, but this movie covers a very large breadth of ideas, and I think that's by design. I saw an interview with Tony Burgess where he basically discussed other zombie movies and how like it's always a metaphor for something. It's a metaphor for communism or Red Scare or whatever. And in this movie, he said it's a metaphor for a metaphor.
Oh my god.
I
So
don't.
he's Grant Mazzy, is what you're saying.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Basically, Tony Burgess is Grant Mazzy, and he is
Hmm.
definitely infected, and we shouldn't listen to him. But also, I think the larger idea of this movie is that it is throwing in a lot of very disconnected things, like the separatist movement, like the war on terror,
Hmm.
like the fact that it takes place on Valentine's Day. We didn't even
Oh
mention that.
yeah.
That is a really interesting part of the story. Yeah. Again, like something that's kind of corrupted, right? It's like supposed to be
Yeah,
about love and connection, but it's also a very commercialized, dystopian kind of way of connecting.
yeah,
Yeah,
This
totally.
obligated love, you know.
but I think he's kind of taking all these ideas and throwing them at you to see if you will form a connection between them. And then if you do find a connection, then is that what makes you infected or is that what cures you of the infection? Because it's almost like he's challenging us to ask if there actually is a connection or not, or if it's
Hmm.
just absurd.
Hmm. Hmm.
Love it.
All right. Well, I guess that brings us to Rob's favorite part of the show, the bone review section, where we rate Pontypool on a scale of 1 to 4 bones with half bones in between. Starting us off this week is Devin Shepard.
Starting us off every week. And now that I'm thinking about it, I just let's kick it off.
I mean, that's true. It's just the way we've rearranged we keep, because when it was the three of us in every episode, we would alternate who starts it, but now we kind of have like a more set order.
Yeah. Pontypool. I do really love Pontypool. I remember the first time watching it, and David will probably mention this in his review as well, but I was like, everyone needs to watch this movie. This was like one of those indie movies that I'm like, oh, I love indie horror. It's doing so much. Second watch, almost like 11 years later, very different. But also because of all these great conversations that we had today, it's different because I think I'm understanding things more and like have more knowledge about like history and like what it's trying to say or what it's trying to like make us think. So much more respect to the writing, I think this time around. I think this movie, it's again single location and it's so tense and like the pacing is done so well. I'm in it the whole entire time. Grant Mazzy is such a great character and it's such a beautiful performance by McCaddy. And I could do without the kissing. But other than that, I think this is a 3 bone movie for me. Probably a little maybe a little bit higher if I watch it again and think about it more, but 3.5 bones for me.
They are married in real life. I have to.
What?
Wait,
Yeah,
what?
I thought I knew that, and then as we were talking, I looked it up. But yes, the actor Stephen McHattie and Lisa Houle are married in real life. They have three
Oh,
children.
good for
Was not expecting that. Okay.
them.
Ellie, please grace us with your bone review.
Okay, so I think for me, this is hovering around a 3 bones review. I want to take points off for the brown face. It really shocks me every time. I'm never ready for it. Every time, every watch, I'm like, oh, holy shit, you made me sit through a child in brown face. Okay, it's very, I think, dated way of talking about racism. That sadly is still a debate that happens to this day. But yes, I think a 3 bone is warranted for this movie, and I feel like if you enjoyed Pontypool, you should check out something that I kind of think of as a maybe a spiritual sequel or like a sister movie, which is Jeff Barnaby's Blood Quantum from 2019. another really interesting take on the zombie.
All right. I have mixed feelings. Yeah, I was also onto this movie about 10 years ago when my new friend Devin Shepard kept telling me over and over again to watch Pontypool, and then I was like, okay. And because of that, for the longest time, I thought it came out in the early 2010s. I did not realize how early it was. But anyway, I somewhat agree with Ryan Hollinger's review, if anyone has watched his channel, where I think that the first half of the movie is brilliant, and the second half is it a little bit loses its hook for me. I think what throws me is actually the doctor when he just climbs in the window and starts just like giving them exposition that everyone just takes at face value, and that throws it for me.
He's a little goofy.
I kind of wish they'd at least like had someone more official like call into the show or something instead of just Deus Ex Machina crawling through the window. The ending is still interesting, even if it's messy, and it doesn't ruin it for me. It just doesn't quite live up to the first half, where it's very mysterious and isolated and weird, and I enjoy the weird. So I'm giving it 2.5 bones.
Very
Mm.
good. Respectable.
Yeah, respect. I think we're all hovering around the same place, which is it's pretty good. It's a pretty good
Yeah.
thing to do. Well, that wraps up our conversation on Pontypool. You can join us next time where we will be comparing it to She Dies Tomorrow, and Ellie will be back for that discussion. Ellie, if you can tell the people where to find you.
Yes, come follow me on Instagram at badcritic with an underscore at the end. And if you don't like using meta platforms, well, you can follow me on Medium, medium.com/badcritic. And sometimes I tweet, but it's usually in the middle of the night. So don't pay attention to that stuff.
Yeah, and we'll have all the links for Ellie's socials and as well as her Medium page in the show notes. So go check that out. And then, as always, you can find us Cadaver Dogs at cadaverdogspod on Instagram and Twitter, even though we don't really tweet anymore, and Cadaver Dogs Podcast on TikTok. All right, join us next time again for She Dies Tomorrow, where we talk about more cursed language. See you, mutts.
Peace. Sydney Briar is alive.
Sydney Briar is alive.
Sydney
Sydney
Briar
Briar
is
is
alive.
alive.